Welcome everyone to Parshat Hashavua with Reb Shlomo Carlebach from the book Even Shlomo. This is the first week in a couple that we only have one Parsha, and we're beginning a new book, the Book of Bamidbar. But before we start, I want to take the opportunity that our new book, Maaseh Merkavah, The Workings of the Chariot, is now up on Amazon. And especially for all of you who followed the whole series we did on Maaseh Merkavah, my great thanks to all of you for making it possible, because the book comes right from the classes, and we're very, very excited. It just went up just in the last 24 hours. The book just went up, and it is available, and hopefully everyone will get a copy. Bezrat Hashem. Okay, the Book of Bamidbar with Reb Shlomo. So let's start. He says, Bereshit is the book of creation. Shemot is the book of redemption. Vayikra is the book of serving God. And Bamidbar is the book of mistakes. This is going to be the theme for this whole evening. And it's not just this Parsha. Reb Shlomo was very, very influenced by the Mei Shiloach, the Ishbitzer Rebbe. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe follows a theme through the whole book of Bamidbar and dealing with the mistakes. We don't see it so much in the Parsha today, but here, because we're starting a new book, he's labeling the whole book, the book of mistakes. So he says like this: everyone makes mistakes until you reach the level that it is so deep inside of you, until it is mamish part of your blood, you have to make so many mistakes. Okay, so why is Reb Shlomo saying this? Is when you go through the book of Bamidbar, we have a whole series of revolts, calamities, rebellions, wars, mistakes, just almost parsha after parsha for most of the book. So that's why he's already picking up, even though in specifically in the Parsha Bamidbar, you don't see those mistakes, but they're coming. They are coming. So he says like this. So in other words, he's saying is like the deeper you try to go in life, in your neshama, it's inevitable that you're going to make mistakes and you're going to fall. And the question is, well, what do you do with that? So we discussed this a bit in previous weeks already, but here he's focusing on the idea of mistakes. Why is it so hard to be a Jew? Because you have to make so many mistakes until it gets into you. To become anything, you have to make mistakes. You also have to make a lot of mistakes to be a shoemaker. You have to make even more mistakes to be a doctor. Because the higher something is, the more mistakes have to be made. So he's obviously saying something very profound here is, I think in previous works we said that the higher you go, the harder you fall. It's the same thing here as when you're striving. If you're not striving for anything and you're not stretching your limits and you get into a comfort zone, then you may make less mistakes because the stakes aren't so high. But when you're trying to do something great, or just simply you're trying to purify your soul, you're trying to get close to God, then it's inevitable that you'll make mistakes. But of course, what we'll deal with through many of these parshas is, so what do you do with the mistakes? Remember, we learned the verse, Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'kam. 7 times that Tzadik falls and gets up. And if you remember, what we learned is, who says that Tzadik is falling? Isn't it Tzadik someone who doesn't fall? Isn't it Tzadik, as it were, perfect, beyond making mistakes? So our tradition says no. Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'kam. A tzaddik may fall 7 times. Now, it could be the fall of a tzaddik is so subtle, we wouldn't even notice it. Again, a mistake is not necessarily a sin. A mistake is just short of perfection. We'll say it that way. Okay, so he says like this. There are 2 kinds of learning. There is a learning that 1 + 1 = 2. 3 + 3 = 6. But then there is a deeper kind of learning. Every one of us has 2 relationships with God. When it comes to learning how to put on tefillin, or you put in any mitzvah here that you want, fill in the blank. Someone shows me how to do it a few times, and then I know how to do it. If my relationship with God is on the level of whether to do something or not to do it, it doesn't take many mistakes. There's 1 + 1 = 2. The chances are you're not going to say it equals 3. It's that kind of learning. But when you're going for something really deep and profound, so there are challenges along the way. But the deep relationship between me and God, mamish, takes a lifetime. He says, this is what the Ishbitzer says the book of Bamidbar is all about. So here he's sourcing really who he is getting this whole idea of Bamidbar being the book of mistakes. Okay, so we're just starting here. Now he says like this. You can do everything right in life and not get to the point. If you ask someone you love to marry you and you explain that you will do everything they want you to do, how far can that go? It's got to be deeper than that. Imagine I say the same to God. I tell God, I'll do anything you want me to do. Reb Shlomo says a person can still be off. It takes something deeper than that. Do you think the highest you can offer God is to do everything right? So this is a typical Reb Shlomo teaching. This idea that doing everything right it's great. It's very good. But doesn't God want deeper than us? In other words, we can do all of the mitzvahs with no heart and soul. We can go through the motions and do all of the mitzvahs. That's what he's trying to say. You can do everything right, but you're still missing the point. You're not doing with your heart and soul. This was a constant refrain in Reb Shlomo's teachings. So he says again, it's possible to do everything right and still be off. If you follow the portions in Bamidbar, we see that even Moshe Rabbeinu made a mistake. But look what he says. But do you think that because you make one mistake, you're out of the game? You're still Moshe Rabbeinu is still Moshe Rabbeinu. When I'm very close to someone, the closeness does not depend on how much they are doing my will. There are a lot of people that are very holy, but when it comes to the most important test of their lives, they are failing. When it comes to the most important test of someone's life, it takes something else than just doing right. Another teacher who teaches this constantly is the Slonim Rebbe in his classic book, Netivot Shalom. He makes this point very, very often. In other words, what Reb Shlomo is saying is not unique to Reb Shlomo. This is a Hasidic idea that God wants our whole heart and soul. And so doing everything right doesn't guarantee a deep relationship with other people or with God. As holy as Moshe Rabbeinu was, he obviously needed one more inch to get to the Holy Land. It may even be forbidden to talk like that, because the story of Moshe Rabbeinu and why he didn't go to Eretz Yisrael is much deeper than the simple understanding of the text. But like the Rebbe said, since it is in the Torah, we are learning from it. What we have to learn from all of this is that everything can be right. You can be the holy of holiest till this very moment. But in the next 5 minutes, the Rabboni Sha'olam can give you a test and you can fail. So this is actually said in Pirkei Avot. It says, and Pirkei Avot is not Hasidus, it's not Kabbalah. Pirkei Avot says that a person shouldn't trust themselves to the moment they leave this world. Because in theory, someone could be a tzaddik their whole life, and at the last moment, go off track. For those who followed our series on the books of the prophets, so this is what happened to Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest person ever, he also went off at the end. He went off. So what Reb Shlomo is saying is that just because a person passed 100 previous tests, that's no guarantee for the 101st test. So in other words, we have to stay on our toes, and we can't depend on our own righteousness to get us through if at the moment we're not 100% there. We're just kind of like going on steam. We're going on what we've done before. So what we just learned, this is a typical teaching from Reb Shlomo of never be satisfied with whatever level you're on. Don't ever think you've accomplished everything you can accomplish, that you're as close to God as you can come. You should never think that. It says in Pirkei Avot, Eze Asher Hasameach Bechelko. Who is the wise one? Who is the happy one? The one who is happy with their lot. And so we're told that this is true for material reality, that we should be happy with what we have materially. It doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for more, but it shouldn't be that we're unhappy if we don't have more. The truly happy person is one who's happy with what they have. They appreciate it. They feel gratitude. They feel joy for it. I have to say, I see Shlomo Katz's father and mother-in-law tonight. And so, as I've done almost every week, we always quote that it's Shlomo Katz's book that we are learning from. So I learned a beautiful thing from him. It's not his chiddush, but I learned it from him, that there's a way of understanding who is the joyous one who's happy with their lot. So in Hebrew, hasameach bechelko, he's happy with his portion. So you can translate a person's happy with their own portion, or what I learned from Shlomo is that you can be happy, you should be happy with someone else's portion. In other words, if you see someone else succeeding, thriving, you should be really happy. Shouldn't be jealous or why that guy? What did he do to deserve it? So that was a beautiful teaching I learned from Reb Shlomo Katz. And you can tell him that I quoted him. But further, we're told that saying, Eze asher asamech b'chalko, does not apply to spiritual matters. That one should never be satisfied with whatever spiritual level they're on. They don't have to be unhappy about it, but a person should realize that they can go farther, deeper, and higher, and never be satisfied. I made it. I got as far as I can. The way I keep Shabbos is perfect. Nothing else. Nothing else to learn. Nothing else to experience. We should never have that attitude. Okay, now continuing. So this one is called the Torah of the Desert. And for those who have the book, by the way, I'm on page 138. We don't have time for me to read every paragraph. So I just picked out which paragraphs that I think we can get the most out of in the least amount of time. So this is called the Torah of the Desert. What is so powerful about the desert? Reb Leibele, this means Leibele Eger, a Hasidic Rebbe in the line of Ishbitz, says that in the desert, until you have a map, you will never make it out of there. The question is, how much are you asking for a map? And once you have a map, how much are you guarding it? In other words, imagine you're maybe lost in the desert. If you don't have a map, you look around and all you see is sand dunes. How are you going to get out? You need a map to get out. So, of course, the map, as he'll explain now, is the Torah. And when we have the Torah, how much are we guarding it? If you take a map on your tiyul into the desert, and you're not really guarding your possessions and you lose the map, well, what good was it that you brought it? You have to make sure not only that you have a map, but you can access it. So Reb Shlomo continues, the Torah is only given to those who mamish pray for it like they are in the desert. So everyone try to integrate that. The Torah is only given to those who mamish pray for it like they are in the desert. In other words, having the Torah is not a given. We have to pray, and we actually do. On Shabbos, we actually say, V'tein chelkenu b'toratecha. Please give us our portion in your Torah. I know every Shabbos, I always focus on those words because it's not a given. You're religious, you keep mitzvahs, but it doesn't mean that you have your portion in the Torah. Another way of saying is that there are 70 faces to the Torah. The Arizal said there's 600,000 faces to the Torah, one for each root soul in Israel. So that means everyone has their face in the Torah. How much are we striving and praying that we find and can manifest our face in the Torah? Okay, so Reb Shlomo continues. If you think you can do without the Torah is not given to you. In other words, if you think it's a given, my connection to the Torah is it's a given. He says, in a certain way, you don't have the Torah. Imagine someone sitting in the desert without a map. How much are they crying? And also, you have to guard the Torah so much. In other words, how much are we crying over our desire to really have our portion in the Torah? How much are we praying to have our portion in the Torah? Now he says something really important. He says, there are two kinds of Torah in this world. First, there is a Torah which I can inherit from people before me. There is a Torah that my father and my mother taught me, that was taught by their parents and was taught to them by their parents, and so on. That's the Torah that I have, all the ways back, all the generations. Then there is another Torah, the Torah of Ein Adam Omed al Divrei Torah Ela Im Kain Nishal Behem. So this in a certain way is the teaching from the sages that we're basing this whole idea of the Torah of mistakes. What does it say? It's in the Gemara of Gittin. It says there's no person who stands on the words of Torah. Here it stands means who has been able to integrate, except if they stumble over those words. So this is from the sages. In other words, it shouldn't be taken as only, but what it's saying is there's a certain kind of learning that unless we fall over it, we make a mistake, we blow it, that we can actually learn it. And this is a general principle in life, not just with the Torah, that it goes back to what Reb Shlomo said, 1 + 1 = 2. That's a certain kind of learning. But there's another learning that only comes to experience, and not every experience happens perfectly. And when we fall and we learn the lesson, then we truly integrate it. That's what the sages are saying. Again, in Hebrew, Ein Adam Omed al Divrei Torah Ela Im Kain Nishal Behem, that a person doesn't stand or integrate the words of Torah except if he stumbles over them. So this is a very, very deep learning. And so now you can understand where the idea of the Ishbitzer and Reb Shlomo get this, because if you look at Bamidbar, you could say, why are all these stories in the Torah? Isn't this a holy book that's supposed to be like super spiritual? Why is it recording all of these mistakes, all of these sins, all of these rebellions? Because we're supposed to learn from them. Supposed to learn from them. In other words, a person does not know how to keep the Torah unless he first fails. This is a Torah that you cannot inherit from anybody. You know, this only comes through personal experience. This is the desert Torah. The idea of Bamidbar means literally in the desert. This is the Torah of the desert, is how do you make it through a foreboding place like the desert? Well, sometimes you have to stumble in order to learn the proper lessons, in order not to repeat them. In the desert, there is nothing. There's a certain Torah, ba'oel moed. There is a certain house already built, and I'm relying on it. So here he's mentioned that we have a Mishkan. We have the temple in Jerusalem. You could say we have the synagogue. We have established places of holiness, and I'm relying on it. And then there is a Torah where I have no one to rely on because no one can even tell me. I have to make the mistake myself. So this we know parents and children. Parents try to warn their children about certain situations and do their best. And sometimes even I can remember my doing this and my children. It's like, well, I need to learn it on my own. Even if you're right, even if I make the mistake, but I have to learn it on my own. So parents and teachers do their best, but ultimately the greatest teaching is to raise children and students who will be strong enough that even if they make a mistake, it won't be a permanent fall. It will be a stepping stone for a learning experience that they will have for their whole lives. And I'm sure everyone can relate to this, that we did certain things, and then it was like, I'll never do that again. And we live by it. We learned a very deep lesson, and then we integrate it in a way that actually propels us forward. Okay, now Reb Shlomo is continuing with an idea he calls until it permeates my insides. He says, do you know how much pain we have to go through in our lives? We have to go through so much pain and make so many mistakes, filling us with so many disappointments. Yet God is teaching us something through every detail in our lives. The question is, what am I learning from all of my mistakes? What am I learning from all of my pain? So if we get lost in the mistakes and pain, it turns out to be the very opposite of what they're there to teach us. What did we learn from those 40 years of mistakes? Because in this book, this is where we live. We were on our way to Eretz Yisrael. We were not supposed to be in the desert for 40 years, at least in theory. Through a series of mistakes with the spies, we ended up 40 years in the desert. So Reb Shlomo is saying, well, what did we learn during those 40 years? What did we know afterwards that we didn't know before? Sometimes we go through so much and we ask ourselves, do I really know more now than I knew before? Is there anything you can, mamish, put on a piece of paper that I didn't know before? So he says, this is a major breakthrough going through the whole Mea Shiloh, in other words, through the whole teachings of the Ishbitzer Rebbe. Says like this, everyone is capable of 1 minute of holiness. Every Jew is capable of a little Jewish self-consciousness. Maybe just for 5 minutes. On Yom Kippur, every Jew has a Jew attack and runs to shul. On Israel Independence Day, everyone has a little Israel self-conscious attack. The question is, how much really stays with you? How much is it penetrating your bones? How much of what you know and how much of what you are doing penetrates your toenails? So this is also Reb Shlomo's kind of language, meaning how much is it getting into you, into your core being? Every experience, every parsha that we read, is it getting into us? Every holiday, is something lasting a minute later, I'll never forget one time, not mentioning where, I was there for Yom Kippur. It was a beautiful Yom Kippur. Not more than 5 minutes after Yom Kippur, a huge fight broke out between a bunch of people. And I'm standing there, it's like, oh my gosh, like, where did Yom Kippur go? Like, what happened? That's like an extreme example, but what Reb Shlomo is saying, with all experiences in life, we just had Lag BaOmer. How much did Lag BaOmer really touch us? How much got into our bones, our toenails? Pesach was only 38 days ago. Is there anything left from what we learned on Pesach? That's what we have to continue asking ourselves. With every experience, not only what did I learn from it, but what will become a permanent part of my consciousness? You see, Reb Shlomo is pushing us. All of his Torah is like pushing us to go farther. Okay, so now he says, what does the land of Israel mean? Why do we have so much trouble with the land of Israel? God gave us the Torah at Sinai and said, do this and don't do this. But that's not always the problem. The problem is always the land of Israel. We were driven out of Israel. The Holy Temple was destroyed twice, and we have so much trouble trying to get back. It's a very, very current discussion. The Ishbitzer says that the land of Israel represents a life where the Torah has permeated into my physical existence. The Torah is not in my head or my heart. The Torah is in my toenails. If my body is permeated with the Torah, then I belong in Israel. Or in a plural sense, when being in Israel gets to our inner self, that's when we'll be able to truly inherit it. And I could say, without going out on a tangent, there's no doubt that after October 7th, there was a tremendous awakening, not just in Israel, by Jews around the world to pay attention to what it means to be a Jew. What does it mean to hold on to Eretz Yisrael? What does it mean that we're there after 2,000 years? This is a very, very appropriate discussion that Reb Shlomo is touching on. So he continues, after Mount Sinai, we made a golden calf. Everyone asks, how can it be after just 40 days of receiving the Torah and the greatest revelation in all of history, we made a golden calf? So Reb Shlomo says, because sadly enough, the Torah didn't permeate us. If you learn something and then 2 minutes later you do the opposite of what you learned, just like my example of Yom Kippur, it doesn't mean you didn't learn anything. Oh no, actually he says something different. It says it doesn't mean that you didn't learn what you learned, but it hasn't reached you yet. In other words, you experienced Yom Kippur, but it didn't reach your insides yet. It's so like floating around you. It's on the outside. That's a big thing in Chassidut. Two words, Panimiut, which means getting it in your inside, and Chitzoniut, when something it's there, You learned it, you did it, but it's on the outside. Imagine you learn all the teachings on how horrible it is to yell at someone. And as you close the book, someone starts making noise next door and you begin to yell at him. It doesn't mean you didn't understand what you just learned. It simply means it didn't permeate you. This is something that's very true for all of us, that we learn things, we find it meaningful, and then we also find 5 minutes later, 5 days later, we do something it's quite the opposite of what we learned. Okay. So he says like this. Now he's just touching on two examples from the book of Bamidbar. He says, Korach, he was the one who led a rebellion against Moshe, was a holy man. But somewhere inside of him, there was a little dark place that wasn't reached yet. What was wrong with the spies? They were very holy people. That's why Moshe chose them. They had clear prophecy, but there was still one place left that was still dark. So he tells a story of Reb Tzadok Cohen, another of the Rebbes in the line of Ishbitz, that before he passed away, he started to look deep into his veins. I guess he was holding up his hand and he was like looking at the veins of his hand. And his pupils asked him, "What are you looking at, Rebbe?" And he said, "I want to see if the Torah mamash reached my veins." This reminds me of a story of the Alter Rebbe. I know I've told it before, that before he passed away, he was staring intensely at the beams in the ceiling. And his students saw he was like super focused on looking at these beams of wood. And they said, "Rebbe, what do you see?" And he said, "I no longer see beams of wood. I only see the light of God that is infusing the logs." Okay, l'chaim, everyone, l'chaim. Okay, now he mentions something about the Haftarah that we read on the book of Bamidbar. Excuse me, on the Parshat Bamidbar. So he says, it begins where it says, "V'haya mispar b'nei Yisrael kechol hayam asher le'yamod v'lo yisaper." So it says that the number of the children of Israel is like the sand on the shores of the sea, that is impossible to count. So he says like this, he says, it's very strange. The number is a non-number. In other words, the number of Bnei Yisrael is a number that can't be counted. He said that's a little bit contradictory. Is it a finite number or is it infinite? So he says like this, what are we busy with in this world? On one hand, we are living a very finite and limited life. When I don't sleep, I can't function the next morning. So now he tells a story. He said someone came to the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, meaning 2 Rebbes ago, the Friedeker Rebbe, and said, I would like to study all night, and then tomorrow I will be like a different person. So the Rebbe said to him, you're right, you will be a different person. Everyone will be learning and you'll be sleeping. In other words, not such a great idea to stay up all night and think that you'll become a different person. He said, you're right. You'll be different from everyone else during the day. You'll be asleep. So Reb Shlomo says, so you have to sleep, you have to eat. You cannot be in 2 places at the same time. In other words, we live a very finite life. But then he says, on the other hand, I have such an urge to be infinite. I'd like to be in 15 places at the same time. In other words, there's something deep in the soul, because we have a point of godliness in the soul, and God is infinite. So even though we live a very finite life full of borders and measurements and things that stop us from being infinite, but deep in the soul there is that place that not only do we want to be infinite, but there are moments that we can actually experience infiniteness. Okay. So now he's continuing. For those who are following, we're on page 146. This is called dealing with infinity. He says, when God created the world was finite. God wanted Adam to eat from the tree of life in order to make the world infinite. So this is a very, very profound idea in of itself, that God is infinite, but the world that he made was finite. But eating from the tree of life represents how a human being can, in a certain way, transcend finiteness, and through human consciousness, the whole world can taste being infinite. After Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, he made the world even more finite. So in other words, the result from eating from the tree of knowledge was the opposite of eating from the tree of life. It made everything even more closed off, more finite. Everything became measured based on being good or bad with a yardstick. Here comes Noah, and there was a tremendous awakening of wanting to be infinite. But people didn't know how to do it, so they ended up doing everything wrong. What happened? Infinite rain, as it were, came down from heaven. Then comes Avraham Avinu, and something changes. Then he quotes, and this is the name of my book about Avraham Avinu, is Echad Haya Avram. One was Avram. It's a verse from Yechezkel, from Ezekiel. Do you know how infinite Avraham Avinu was? Gewalt was he infinite. There were no doors in his house or his tent. According to tradition, his tent was open on all 4 sides. 3 days after his circumcision, he gets up and slaughters 3 oxen for the strangers who he thought were pagans. You have to be pretty infinite to do that. But we know about Avram Avinu. It says, "Avram Zaken ba biyamim, Avram berach et Avram bakol." Avram became old in wisdom, and he came into days, and God blessed him with everything. So there's many, many commentaries about this. But what does it mean he came into days? So we're told that in this world, he had 1 foot in this world and 1 foot in the world to come. In other words, he had 1 foot in the finite world, but his consciousness was very much already in the world to come. And I want to go back to Noah. So we know that after the ark landed and Noah came out, it says the first thing he did was he planted a vineyard. And then he drank from the vineyard and he became drunk. And tragedy occurred to him, and we'll leave it at that. But the question everyone asks is, why was that the first thing he did? Was at least the first thing we're told he did, when he planted a vineyard. And so in short, one of the answers is that one of the opinions of what the tree of knowledge was grapes, from which we get wine. And so it's a new world. Noah had a unique experience. He was like Adam. He experienced a new world. And so he wanted like a replay. He wanted to try to fix the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but he fell. He failed. He made a mistake. That was just an aside. Now, Reb Shlomo says, now as much as I love the whole world, I have to be able to love one person infinitely more than the whole world. This is a very deep concept. There are many people who are very social causes focused, saving the world, making the world better, caring for every disaster that happens, every injustice. Now, of course, this is a wonderful thing, but many, many, many times what happens is people who love the whole world have a very hard time loving just one person. It's a very common experience that people have. It's easier to love the whole world than to really love one person. So that's what Reb Shlomo is saying here. So he says, if there is someone I love very much, I meet them at a place I love more than any other place in the world. So in other words, if I love someone very much, I want to take them to my special place. So Reb Lebele Eger says that until Avram Avinu, there was no need for God to have a special place in the world. There was nobody so close to God that God needed a special place. But when Avram Avinu comes on the scene, God says, I have a special place just for you and me. And that's when he says, Lech lecha ma'artzecha, go out from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. Ela oretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. So Reb Shlomo is saying just a really awesome thing here, that this is the first time that Eretz Yisrael is mentioned. And is only mentioned that he's giving it to Avraham Avinu. He's saying, Avraham Avinu, I love you so much. I want to show you my very special place. I'm going to take you to my special place. So this is kind of a little bit of a fanciful idea, but it's so deep, because later in the book of Deuteronomy, we learn that the land of Israel is a land that God seeks out. The eyes of God are on the land from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It's a land that God seeks out. The eyes of God are on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It's one of the most important verses in the Torah, because it's establishing why Eretz Yisrael, even though there's a question, why not someplace else? But the fact that God gave us Eretz Yisrael, so that is teaching us, because it's special to God. Why is it called the Holy Land? Because God chose it. Holy means to choose, to designate, to separate. That's what holy means in a technical sense. So why is it the Holy Land? Because it's a land that God seeks out. He designated it as a special land for Avraham Avinu. That's what makes it holy. God's eyes are on it. That is what makes it holy. Okay, we have just a few more minutes. So he says like this. He tells a story. I'll end with this story. I heard this from Reb Shlomo himself. I heard him say it a couple of times. And the story is like this. He says, do you think the desert is becoming smaller in the world? So he says like this, when the Bubover Rebbe came to America, this is right after the war, the Bubover Rebbe lost his wife and I believe all of his children except one. I think he had like 11 children, and they were all killed in the Holocaust. The Bubover Rebbe, by miracle, made it to America. And at that point, he had a handful of students. And Reb Shlomo, and he was based in Brooklyn. And Reb Shlomo used to go there. This is the late 40s. He used to go there on Saturday night for Malava Malka. There would be one room of Hasidim. Today, there are literally thousands of Bubover Hasidim in Israel and in America. And I once heard him say, actually a number of times, saying half of the stories that he knows and tells, he heard at those Malava Malkas from the Bubover Rebbe. You know, Reb Shlomo had a phenomenal memory, phenomenal. And so when he heard these stories, like he's saying, they got into him, and he was able to give them over. So he tells the story of the Bubover Rebbe. It's really an amazing story. When the Bubover Rebbe first came to Brooklyn, he asked his Hasidim, please take me to Times Square. And even then, Times Square, I would say it's probably cleaned up a bit from what it was. Times Square was a pretty seedy place. Maybe it still is. And they said to him, Rebbe, you really don't want to go to Times Square? He said, no, I want to see it. They go to Times Square. I'm just reading Tova who's online, just said, my building is full of Bubover Hasidim. So they take him to Times Square, and here in the book it says 42nd Street, but I remember Reb Shlomo saying Mamish Times Square. Maybe Times Square is 42nd Street. I don't know. I don't know New York that well. I should. I've been there so many times. Anyways, so he said to his Hasidim like this. He said, in the old country, at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, if someone wanted to sin in Mezebosh, what could he possibly do? What could a person who is part of the Jewish community, it's a shtetl, everyone knows everyone else, there's no place really to go, what is a person going to do wrong? So he says, if a chassid got bored in the middle of Shabbat, sitting by the Baal Shem Tov, and he walks out, where does he go? He goes home to sleep. Where else should he go? In other words, he was saying, in the old country, we didn't have so many temptations. We didn't have that many distractions. We lived in a bubble of Jewish life, of course, surrounded by people who didn't like us so much, but in the shtetl, everything we knew was just right there. And he said, do you see what's happening here? He said, here we could be real Hasidim. Here we have what to distract us. We have what to tempt us. He said, so I just wanted to get the lay of the land to understand where we are. So Reb Shlomo says, friends, the desert is getting stronger. The world offers us more and more, as it were, infinite joy, infinite entertainment, infinite getting out of anything. But every year the Torah is getting deeper and deeper. When Shavuos comes, I have to tune in to the desert cry, which is the deepest crying there is. So the reason he mentions this is that there are certain Torah portions that the sages made sure always came before certain holidays. And one of them is we always read Parshat Bamidbar before Shavuos. In other words, last week we read 49 curses. So the sages wanted to make sure we got through that, and we're starting a new book where one of the ideas of, again, in English, the book is called the Book of Numbers, which is not an exact, obviously it's not an exact translation of Bamidbar. Bamidbar means in the desert. But the theme of this whole Parsha is numbers. And the beginning of next Parsha is also numbers. The numbers of each tribe, the numbers of each group of 3 tribes, and how they camped in the desert and how they marched in the desert. And everything was by family and by tribe, and everything had numbers. And one of Hasidus explains that the idea here in short is everyone counts. Everyone has their place. Everyone has meaning. And so we always read that before Shavuos. Also because everyone stood at Mount Sinai. Everyone stood at Mount Sinai. According to tradition, every Jewish soul that would ever be born was there because of the 600,000 root souls. And every convert that would ever be was also there because their soul was already intrinsically connected to the Jewish people, even at Sinai. So since we were all there, that's like the counting. Everyone was there. Bamidbar. So that's how he ends here. He says, on one hand, like Times Square is getting stronger all the time. For those, I'll age myself. But you remember when there were only 3 TV stations and they went off at midnight? And then you only saw the static, the dots. Now, look, it's 24/7. Everything is 24/7. Remember, 7-Eleven was this huge innovation. Something was open to 11 o'clock at night. Unheard of. 7-Eleven meant 7 in the morning to 11 at night. Unheard of. Something open at night. Do you remember how everything was closed on Sunday? Except mostly entertainment and restaurants. Sports, entertainment, and restaurant were open, but everything else was shut. No stores are open on Sunday. No, nothing. Anyways, so he says the desert is getting stronger, but so is the Torah. The Torah is also getting stronger. So Bezrat Hashem, we will always be connected to the depths of the Torah, and that will be our ticket to infinity.